Wait for your email. Back to when back to when I was a rabbi in Philadelphia. And a couple of years ago, we began together with my friend Terry Schwartz-Russell, who is here on the Zoom with us. We talked about the idea of travel, the transformative potential of travel for deepening our experience of both one another and of the material we're studying. So we began last year with a trip to Spain, particularly Andalusia, and we will talk a little bit more about that trip as we go forward. This year's trip is going to be to Central Europe, to Prague, Budapest, and Vienna. And I have challenged myself in our hour together this afternoon to connect those two trips and to find a point at which the trip to Spain and our upcoming trip to Central Europe actually are telling one continuous story. I want to mention two other things about what I do in my rabbinic retirement alongside teaching. I also chair the National Council of Synagogues, which is an organization that does national interfaith dialogue. We have begun with dialogues that have existed now for decades with the Protestant and Catholic communities, and we are now beginning dialogues with the American Muslim community and planning a Jewish-Muslim trip to Andalusia next year. So again, the transformative potential of travel is much on my mind. And finally,
try again.
Okay,
Sorry, I don't understand.
Okay, I am not sure why Siri is somehow entering this conversation, but I will try to stop that. The other thing I just wanted to mention is that I am also the winter rabbi at the island nation of Barbados. So that's another part of my retirement. So that is a little bit of who I am and what I am doing. And at the center of it is this idea of study and travel. So our topic today is the Central European roots of Jewish secularism in preparation for our trip this spring. And I want to mention before we go any further that there is something wonderful happening at the Huntington Theater in Boston right now, which is a play about the Central European Jewish experience, Tom Stoppert's play Leopoldstadt. And of the figures that we are going to be studying as part of our course this spring, Freud, Kafka, and Herzl, Freud and Herzl play major roles in the play Leopoldstadt. If any of you have the opportunity to see it, I want to strongly recommend that play to you, in particular if you're interested in following up with us about the experience in the 19th and 20th centuries of the Jews of Central Europe. So that's by way of background, what we're going to try to accomplish today. But I want to begin not in modernity, but I want to begin in the 4th century. I want to begin 1600 years ago. And I am going to screen share. Hold on a second. Here we go. Okay. So there is a report from a church father writing in the land of Israel in the early Middle Ages, where he reports that in the 4th century, this is what was happening in a place in Israel called the Oak of Mamre. Some of you will remember the oak or the terebinths of Mamre. This is the place where Abraham met the 3 angels. So it's a rather special place. And we are told that in the year 300, there was a festival that took place every year in the place where Abraham met the angels. Here's the festival. Take a look in the second paragraph. Here, the inhabitants of the country and the regions around Palestine, the Phoenicians and the Arabians, assemble annually every summer to keep a brilliant feast, and many others, both buyers and sellers, resort there on account of the fair. So there is, at the place where Abraham met the angels, a gigantic fair, a gigantic party where people of all religions and ethnicities come together. The feast is frequented by all nations, by the Jews, because Abraham was their ancestor, by the pagans, because they acknowledge that that's a place where angels and humanity met, and by the Christians, because the Christians trace Jesus's line and the significance of Christ to the story of Abraham having become a believer. The place was moreover honored fittingly with religious exercises. Some prayed to the God of all, some called on angels, poured out wine, burnt incense, offered an ox, a he-goat, or a sheep, or a cock. So what basically is happening here? People from all different religions come together for a gigantic party. Everybody worships God the way they wanted to worship God. And Christians, Jews, and pagans all are together celebrating the fact that they have a common story, that this was a place where something special happened. Constantine, the Roman emperor who legitimized Christianity, when he found out about this event, he was furious. He rebuked the bishops of Palestine in no measured terms because they neglected their duty and allowed a holy place to be defiled. So, what is the story that we are seeing from what happened in Mamre in the land of Israel 1400, 1500 years ago, 1600 years ago? That there was a place where, without regard to religion, you were able to see the commonalities that linked all of these religious traditions together. And for some period of time, that continued as a celebration. Hold on to that. And now let me add one other celebration to this. Okay. Here is a story told about the city of Baghdad. Now, I want you to remember something. Hold on to your map of the world. Baghdad is in Iraq. Mamre is in the land of Israel. And then we go over the North Africa to Spain. And from Baghdad to Spain, throughout North Africa, including the land of Israel, is all under Islam. At the end of the 10th century, Abu Umar ibn Sadi, a pious theologian, traveled from Spain to Baghdad. Can you hold on to how strange that is, how amazing that is, that you were able to travel from Iraq to Spain and be under one government, one thought world in that entire trip? On his way home, he was asked in Kairouan, Kairouan is in North Africa, on his way back to Spain from Baghdad, he was asked if he went to any of the theology conferences that took place in Baghdad. And he said, I went twice, and I was glad to be done with it. Why? Why didn't you enjoy the conferences? The first meeting I went to was attended not only by members of every sect of Islam, Orthodox and heretical, but also by miscreants. Miscreants being people we don't really like, atheists, materialists, Jews, Christians, unbelievers of every sort. Each sect had a leader to defend their views, and whenever one of these came into a room, they all rose. Soon the hall was crowded, and somebody got up to speak. We have come here together to reason. All of you know the rules. Muslims are not to bring arguments against us drawn from the Quran or leaning on the authority of Muhammad, since we do not believe in either. All of us must rely on arguments based on human reason. Are you guys following what that was? There was a moment in the 800s in Iraq, in Baghdad, where people from all different religions would get together for academic conferences. And they agreed that in the conference, you cannot quote anything that's particular to your religious tradition, not just Muslims, but Jews and Christians as well, everything had to rely on human reason. It's flabbergasting to imagine that long ago, there was a commitment to reason, which in the West would not reappear until the Enlightenment. And we'll get back to that in a moment when we turn to Central Europe. Okay, so let's look now. First of all, any questions or comments? Does everybody get what we're looking at here? That in this moment, in the early Middle Ages, long before the Dark Ages, long before the Enlightenment, long before modernity, people from different religious traditions were getting together to celebrate and to study on equal terms whichever religion they were part of. And the story gets even a little bit stranger than that. Just one more second. Anybody, any questions or comments on this piece? Okay. So now let's take a look at the Jewish side. Okay. So I want to introduce somebody named Shmuel HaNagid. So we're now in the 11th century in Spain. And here was a resume. And I want you to listen to this resume and ask yourself, does a resume like this still exist anywhere? He was a scholar, a grammarian, a philologist, a soldier, a merchant, a politician, and a poet. All of those things in one person. He held the position of Prime Minister of Granada and served as a battlefield commander for the Granadan Muslim army, making him arguably the most politically influential Jew in Islamic Spain. So we are now looking at a world in which a man could be a Talmudic scholar and a general and a poet and do all of those things while also functioning as a political leader in a Muslim nation. And then Shmuel HaNagid writes poetry. And I want to read to you 3 short poems of Shmuel HaNagid now, the 11th century in Spain, in this amazing moment of Jews, Christians, and Muslims living together. I'd give everything I own for that gazelle who, rising at night to his harp and flute, saw a cup of wine in my hand and said, "Drink your great blood against my lips." And the moon was cut like a D on a dark robe written in gold. What's going on in this poem? It's an erotic love poem written to a young boy from an older man who is drinking wine, which is not permitted in Islam. And he writes that poem. Let me go to 2 other poems and then we'll see where this is taking us. Look at the jasmine whose branches are green as topaz and its stems and leaves while its blossoms are white as bdellium. With carnelian red in its shoot, it looks like a pallid boy who's shedding the blood of innocent men with his hand. Again, if you think that there are some sexual allusions there, you're probably right. And the final poem. In fact, I love that fawn. In fact, I love that fawn cutting roses in your garden, which is why I earned your wrath. If you could see him, the others would never find you. So this young boy, this fawn, this beloved, says the following to the older man. "Scrape me some honey from your hive," he said. "I'll have mine from your tongue," I replied. Then he bristled and said to me, sullen, "And sin before the living God?" "The sin's on me," I answered, "my Lord." So in this moment of people getting together and of the three traditions meeting and fructifying each other, there is also a shared tradition of poetry between Arabic poets and Hebrew poets who are writing a new religious language that includes references to lovemaking, to homosexual lovemaking, and to drinking wine, none of which were normalized in that society, but all of which were in the poetry of both Muslims and Jews during this moment of early medieval enlightenment. I want to share with you what a Muslim poet, a contemporary, a 20th century Palestinian poet named Mahmoud Darwish. Darwish is really considered the national poet of Palestine. His office is in Ramallah. It's been recreated as a tourist attraction. And he wrote the following about Andalusia, about this moment where Jews and Muslims were writing poetry together. Andalus might have been here or there or anywhere, a meeting place of strangers in the project of building culture. It is not only that there was a Jewish-Muslim coexistence, but that the fates of both people were similar. What happened? The Jews were expelled from Spain, and then years later, the Muslims were expelled from Spain. Al-Andalus, for me, is the realization of the dream of the poem. So again, that sense of what a special place that was, where all of these streams were flowing together of these different traditions. And a man like Shmuel Hanagid could write erotic poetry while also leading troops into battle and while also writing Talmudic exegesis. This never could have happened in the centuries afterwards. This was a product of that special moment. 100 years after Shmuel Hanagid, Yehuda Halevi was an early Zionist poet who wrote about the idea of return to the land of Israel already in the 1100s. And he wrote a book called The Kuzari, where he writes about a Muslim, a Christian, a philosopher, a Jew, all meeting together to debate the validity of their different traditions. And I want to share with you now just one quote from Yehuda Halevi's book, The Kuzari, which again reflects, the Kuzari is one of the major books of medieval Judaism that emphasizes what's special and unique about the Jews and what's special and unique about the land of Israel. And Yehuda Halevi writes the following dialogue. The Christians and Muslims divided the settled world between them, and they conduct war against one another, even though they both worship God. Yet their objective is to kill one another, and each one believes their war is just, and by engaging in war, they will become closer to God. And when fighting, each one believes that by their death, they will earn a place in the Garden of Eden. But we Jews have maintained the purity of our ethics. Okay, that's a rather interesting special pleading for the Jewish people. But the king of the Khazars, Yehuda Halevi says, has an answer. Maybe that would be the case if you had chosen your humble status, but it's only the product of necessity. When you Jews have state power, you're going to kill your enemies too. The rabbi conceded, you have discovered our weakness. Wow. So Yehuda Halevi, even believing in the specialness of the Jewish people, acknowledges that state power, having a military, leads to battle and warfare, and that the Jewish people as a stateless people were pacific, were not fighting wars, but that really was more of an expression of what happened to the Jews rather than something about an inherent morality in Judaism. So that is Yehuda Halevi's perspective. And I want you to hold on to that idea that a Jew writing in Spain, writing out of that experience of convivencia, comes to an understanding that even in morality, the Jews are like everybody else. That sense of unity of humanity. And one final example from the ancient world, or from the medieval world, which is a synagogue in Spain, in Toledo. And this is a photograph of this synagogue in Toledo. And I want you to notice two things about it. First of all, if I told you that this was a mosque in Toledo, you would have believed me, because those arches are typical of Muslim mosque architecture in Granada and in Andalusia during the high point of the Muslim rule in southern Spain. This synagogue was built by Muslim architects. And as you can see, you can't see it well, but on top of the arches, there is inscribed verses. If it was a mosque, the verses would be from the Quran. It's a synagogue, so the verses are from the book of Psalms. And the book of Psalms were a shared text between Jews and Muslims. So what I want you to see here is, and by the way, what did the synagogue become? It became a Roman Catholic church, which is what its status to this day. So in one building in Toledo, you can see all three traditions. So the question that I want to raise, and the question that is motivating for part of our trip to Central Europe that's going to be taking place this spring, both for the course and for the trip, is if the convivencia in Spain was imperfect, but still impacted all three religions, and if there was this legacy of people saying, my religion is not better than yours. We are all struggling to deal with God and to come to an understanding of the divine. But what really is powerful is reason, and not mysticism, and not spirituality, and not what's particular about my religion. But what's really at the core is human reason, which is shared by all of our traditions. So that becomes the sort of lesson of Spain. We then go into the Middle Ages, where reason is demoted and tradition is raised. Your identity is collective. You are part of a religious community, and you have an emphasis on that which is traditional, that which has been handed down. So what emerged out of Andalusia? That sense of reason, that sense of the power of the individual. Think for a moment, for those of you who have been to a Catholic church, and you look up, and the Catholic Church, there are these wonderful pillars directing your attention towards the ceiling. And often the ceiling is dark so that you can't even see the roof of the cathedral from inside, but rather your eyes are directed towards heaven. In that Muslim-built synagogue, everything are individual arches. So you stand under your archway. Everything is on human scale and human level. So what happened to that? What happened to that sense of the individual, that sense of the power of reason, that sense of the unity of all traditions, that sense that we can pray together and study together? Where did that all go? And what I want to argue is that we see in Europe, and in particular, we will examine in Central Europe, how the Enlightenment, that movement in European culture that emphasizes reason and the individual, linked up with Jewish memories of the convivencia in Spain to create modern secular forms of Judaism. So let me repeat that and make sure that that is clear. That you have a sense that Jews and Muslims, through the 11th century and a little bit beyond, shared this amazing vision of a world where we could be together, learn from each other, learn together, translate books together, study Aristotle together. All of that disappears and is reborn in modern times, particularly in the Jewish world, where Jews in modernity, basing themselves on individualism and on human reason, recreate the world as a secular place. And that's what we're going to take a quick look at. And that's where we're going to turn now to the 17th century, to Europe, to that moment where the legacy of Spain meets the Enlightenment, and all of a sudden, Judaism changes forever. Questions or comments or responses is just so that I get a sense, is this clear, new, and then we will turn to Spinoza. Any questions or thoughts about this? Are we okay? All right. Okay. Kim, is there anything in the chat other than from you? Not yet. Okay.
Not yet.
Okay,
But feel
no
free
problem.
to put it in, folks.
Okay. So feel free to share some comments, but now I want to turn to that moment in the 1700s when the Enlightenment bursts forth in Europe, and where there is a Jewish man who came from Spain, whose family comes from Spain, and after the expulsion from Spain moved to Amsterdam, which was a place where Jews could be more free. And he writes a book, Spinoza writes a book called The Theological Political Treatise. And in this book, he says the following about the Bible. He says, look, the Bible has two kinds of laws in it. It has the divine law. And what's the divine law? Do unto others as you would want them to do unto you. Treat people well. The basics of morality. A healthy mind in a healthy body. Basics of living a good life. And then there is the ceremonial laws, the holidays. How to build a state in the land of Israel built around a temple. And if any of you have ever read the 5 books of Moses straight through as though you're reading a novel, and you read in the book of Genesis and you're having a wonderful time and you love all the stories and the complexity of it, and then you get to the middle of the book of Exodus, and all of a sudden the Bible's about how to build a temple and how to worship in a temple, and how many cows and various animals you have to offer on which day. And Spinoza says that's ceremonial law, and that only applied to the ancient Israelites. So that the Bible has in it a core of morality, which is reasonable and is shared by everybody, and then things that are specific to the Jews. But those things that are specific to the Jews are ritual laws and state-building laws, none of which apply anymore now that there's not a Jewish state in the land of Israel. And what later Judaism became, a religion of rabbis, synagogues, and houses of study, has no connection to what's written in the Bible, which knows nothing about synagogues and nothing about rabbis. So Spinoza radically re-understands the Hebrew Bible as only related to specific laws that applied back then. So in the Isaiah, in the prophets, in the Psalms, you get these divine laws, which are the laws of reason and morality, and you put aside the ceremonial laws. Okay, that's sort of interesting. And then Spinoza goes further. He says, the Bible was written by Moses. That's what they tell you. But I can prove to you that the Bible was not written by Moses. Imagine what that meant in a society built around tradition. The tradition was that the Hebrew Bible is the story that was written by Moses after receiving the Torah on Mount Sinai. And Spinoza says, you know something, guys? I read the Bible. In the book of Deuteronomy, it talks about Moses' death. Moses couldn't have written that because he died. So that had to have been written later. In the Bible, it says that when this happened, in the story about Abraham, the Canaanites were then in the land. You guys, some of you have studied this when you studied Bible. If it says, and the Canaanites were then in the land, that means that that verse must have been written hundreds of years after the Canaanites were thrown out of the land of Israel. Who threw the Canaanites out of the land of Israel? Joshua, after Moses. So if this was written hundreds of years after Moses, in other words, the book of Genesis was not written until way later than Moses. And even Ezra, Spinoza quotes the great rabbi from Spain in the Middle Ages, who said, if you understand what this verse means, you understand a great secret. And what was the secret? The secret was that Moses didn't write the Bible. Spinoza, one last thing from Spinoza, and then we'll move on to Kafka. Spinoza then says at the end of this chapter, the time has now come for examining in the same manner the books of the New Testament. In other words, what I just did to the Hebrew Bible, we can do to the Christian Bible too. But as I've learned, you have to know the languages, and I really don't know Greek that well. So I prefer to decline this undertaking. Why is it that Spinoza declined? Oh, okay. Why is it that Spinoza declines to investigate the New Testament in the way that he investigated the Old Testament? Because he doesn't want to get killed or arrested, right? He writes about the Hebrew Bible in a way that would make it obvious that the New Testament also is not an accurate historical account of the life of Christ and of the early church. So, and Spinoza says, I'm going to stop before then. I want to say, by the way, Sigmund Freud, writing in Vienna, will say the same thing about Christianity. When he writes about Judaism, he'll put in a tiny footnote, and everything I just said about Judaism also could apply in terms of deepening our understanding of Christianity, and I'm not going there. Okay. So what have we seen? We've seen that Spinoza, coming from a family from Spain, coming from that rationalist tradition of everybody getting together and everybody being able to share that sense of the truths that all religious traditions are teaching, that is something that we can once again share and come back to in this new liberal world of the Enlightenment. And that is what Spinoza, a Jew from Spain, is one of the major figures in creating. So that is the background to our exploration now of Central Europe. And on our trip this spring, we have chosen 3 beautiful cities to go to: Prague, Budapest, and Vienna. 3 of the cities, each of which has amazing cultural wealth and resources. And our trip to Spain, as all of our trips, will explore exactly those rich cultural resources as well as the Jewish story. And I want to mention, for those of you who were with us on our trip to Spain, you know that one night we went out and saw a flamenco performance. And when we are in Vienna, we'll go to the opera house. But we will also, in each of those cities in our course, look at one figure who was important in the history of Jewish secularism. Sigmund Freud, who wanted to reshape Europe. Remember, what's going on right now? Freud is saying that in Europe, everybody is very concerned about being polite. Everybody is very concerned. Think of Victorian age about, we don't talk about sexuality. We're British, right? We don't talk about those things. We don't go there. And what Freud says is, you know something? All of that politeness, all of that gentility, all of the stuff that you guys hold on to as culture is in fact pushing back against our instincts and drives, which are all about sexuality, and as Freud begins to write about in the 1930s, and we'll read about in our course, also about violence. Freud predicted and understood World War II, even though he died in 1939. Herzl also wants to solve the Jewish problem. Coming out of Budapest and coming out of the oppression of the Jews, and particularly what goes on with the Dreyfus affair in France, Herzl emerges and says, the only solution to the Jewish problem is going to come through the political, by re-entering history and by creating the Zionist movement and returning to the land of Israel. So again, another major trajectory in modern secular Judaism's the political, the Zionist, the idea of creating a Jewish state and national home. And then in Prague, we're going to look at the figure of Franz Kafka, and that's who I want to end with this afternoon. Kafka is an amazingly interesting figure. 1883, he was born. He dies in 1924 of tuberculosis. Who was Franz Kafka? He spoke German and he spoke Yiddish in Czechoslovakia. What was the language in Czechoslovakia? Not German, it was Czech. So he's a German speaker in a Czech environment. He's Jewish in a country where 98% of the citizens were Catholic. And he was diagnosed with incurable tuberculosis through no fault of his own. And that will shape his understanding of a world which is absurd, because all of a sudden, for no reason, with no connection to morality, I am dying of tuberculosis. So Kafka sort of creates that sense of the modern Jewish self-understanding of living in the margins, being separate from the community that I was raised in, having a unique perspective as a result of that separateness, and an understanding that the world is crazy, that the world is absurd. And I want to share with you one of the shortest stories Kafka wrote. I'm not going to screen share it. I'll just read it to you. Please follow along. It's called A Common Confusion. So the title is soaked in irony because there's nothing common about what we're about to read. A common experience resulting in a common confusion. A, again, people don't have names, they have letters. A has to transact important business with B and H. He goes to H for a preliminary interview, accomplishes the journey in 10 minutes and the journey back in the same time, and returns to his family to boast of his trip. The next time he goes again to H, this time to settle his business finally. As that by all appearances will take several hours, he leaves super early in the morning, but although all the accessory circumstances are exactly the same as the day before, instead of 10 minutes, it takes 10 hours to reach H. When he arrives there quite exhausted, he is informed that B, annoyed at his absence, has left an hour earlier to go to A's village and that they must have passed each other along the way. He's advised to wait, but in his anxiety, he races home. He now accomplishes the journey in exactly a second. 10 minutes, 10 hours, a second. At home, he learns that B had arrived quite early, immediately after A's departure, that they had met, and he had reminded him of his business, but A replied, "I'm too busy. I have no time. I've got to leave right away because I've got to meet somebody." So he sees the person he's got to meet and rushes right past him. In spite of this incomprehensible behavior, he waits for A's return. It is true, he had asked several times whether A was not back yet. A rushes upstairs. He's almost at the top of the stairs, about to finally reach B, when he stumbles, twists his ankle, and almost fainting with the pain, incapable even of uttering a cry, only able to moan faintly, he hears B, impossible to tell whether at a great distance or quite near, stamping down the stairs in a violent rage and vanishing for good. Great story, a common confusion, common experience. If this was a Jewish story from before modernity, what would it have been about? Would anybody like to just try that for a second? This story of somebody trying to find someone and never being able to succeed, never getting there, never connecting.
Sounds like a Chelm story.
It does, or a Reb Nachman of Bratslav story also, but yeah, a Chelm story for it's the weirdness of it. It would have been a story about the search for God, right? In pre-modern times, this would have been a story, or in Nachman of Bratslav, who wrote about 100 years earlier, this would have been a story about the impossibility of finding God. And Kafka, setting us up in modernity, understands this instead as a story that is designed for the impossibility of human beings making a deep connection with each other, the alienation that so typifies us in the modern situation. Questions or comments, anything, please, just so that we get a sense of where people are. There's one more short little piece of Kafka I want to share, but let's take a moment first.
Lenny, there was a question in the chat. I'm not sure if it's already been answered, and Mark is on, so he can, if you need more context, he says, I need more data to understand this large idealistic generalizations about the Middle Ages. Really, did the Jews, Christians, and Muslims get along so idealistically? What scholars have supported this picture?
Absolutely, thank you for that. So what I am putting together, especially from that story of Baghdad and the story of Mamre, is that these moments were exceptional, but not impossible. In other words, that there are at least two moments, and in both of them, we get the sense of how Christianity eventually in one case Christianity, in one case Islam, shut them down. So that there was a period where it was okay for people to get together. And Mark, I just want to say that story about Baghdad just blows me away. The idea that that was possible. So it's a little bit of a distant mirror of what might be possible again, but it's not saying that everybody was getting along beautifully. As we all know, Andalusia ends with the pogroms of 1391, when Jews are killed in Sevilla and all over Spain, and then eventually under Ferdinand and Isabella with the expulsion, and the Muslims get expelled afterwards. So I'm not making a broad generalization that everything was wonderful. It was never wonderful. The Jews and the Christians under Islam always had a secondary status. They were dhimmis. But let's not lose track of the fact that Maimonides, Yehuda Halevi, Ibn Gvirol, these amazing poets and philosophers did share a rational view of the world and a view where reason was at the center and reason united us. And that got lost. There's a return in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam to mysticism and to pietism after this world of reason. And it's Spinoza who breaks that consensus about mysticism and piety. Mark, you wanted to follow up, please.
Yeah, I had one more question. Did Spinoza and Kafka and Freud, were they really, I would think, somewhat naive to think of the Torah as a history book? Because, I mean, it loses its mythic quality, it loses its teaching qualities, it loses, I mean, so much. They must have been aware of that. How could they be so simplistic?
Well, again, in Spinoza, in the part that I did not read, he writes about what he calls the divine message of the text, which is what he considers the universal message of the text. In other words, what he pulls out, and by the way, this is a lot. I was the rabbi in Philadelphia for a number of years at the Germantown Jewish Center, and the students at my synagogue were divided between those who went to Jewish day schools and those who went to Quaker schools. And I would sit with these kids in high school and I would ask them, what's the difference between Quakers and what you're learning in Quaker meetings and what you see in the synagogue? And they would say, oh no, it's all teaching the same thing. And I would say to the kids, do you notice that that Quakers do really better with silence than Jews do? But the larger point was that, we tend to put it all in a Cuisinart. So I'm not sure. So Spinoza was not denying that aspect of the text. He was simply saying that the ritual law, and this is something where if you read the Bible, you'll actually see his point, that the ritual law was really specific to a temple state in Jerusalem. And once the temple is gone, we need a radically new form of Judaism. Judaism then develops in the rabbinic modality. Spinoza was not actually interested in how rabbinic Judaism reimagines Judaism after the temple is destroyed. He was interested in the Bible, in part because he was a European and the Bible was the shared text. The Talmud was not a shared text.
There was another question in the chat from Marcy Lidman. Did the emergence of science impact the transition from focus on search for connection to God to search for connection to people? In general, did other forces serve as catalysts for this shift?
Sure. So again, one of the things that happens in modernity, of course, is the increase in technology and in science. But what I want you to notice is that in that earlier moment, in that earlier sort of moment of Islamic rationalism in Spain, what was the catalyst that created that moment? The translation of ancient Greek literature, including scientific literature, into Arabic and Latin. So in other words, just as we might say modernity was impacted by technological advances, imagine that in Spain, hundreds of years before Europe had bathrooms and sanitation systems and everything else, the Muslims go to Granada and rebuild the Roman aqueducts and rebuild the sanitation system and recreate the arches and the other things that now they understand from the legacy of Greece. So yes, there is that external thing. And then when the reaction against reason takes place, the Muslims who come from North Africa basically destroy what they found. So, culture goes up and down. And I want us not to lose sight of that earlier moment, but I want you to understand, but here's the real thesis that I'm playing with, and we'll end with this, that in Judaism, the triumph of secularism, the idea that today Jewish leaders come from the arts, come from politics, come from movies and television. You take a look at who are the 20 best known Jews in America. There are no rabbis on that list. The list is all popular culture. How did that happen? That the Jewish community is led by Steven Spielberg and not by Sharon Cohn-Anisfeld. So how did that occur? And I want to argue that it's part of the legacy of ancient rationalism, as we saw in the Middle Ages, plus the Enlightenment in Europe, leads to the variety of modern Judaisms. So that's my larger thesis. So my friends, I'm going to turn things back to Kim to bring closure to this, but I want to just let everybody know we're going to be offering a class. We are offering a class this fall, which is going to be a follow-up to the Spain trip and deal with some of these connections and deepen our understanding of the philosophical origins of what happened in Spain. So we're going to do that this fall. In the spring, there will be a class leading up to the Prague, Budapest, and Vienna trip. And then May 5th through 15th will be that trip. And I just wanted to remind everybody, the trip combines fun, high culture, and some learning as we go through. Kim, I'll turn things back to you.
Thank you so much. And what a wonderful way to kick off our Grow session and really contextualizing that past or present and imagining what might be in the future, which is the essence of Tamid. So thank you so much. I am going to hit enter now, and let's see if this puts the links you need in the chat, which is the direct link to the course that Rabbi Gordon mentioned, our full course catalog and events. I do want to say that you don't have to participate in all aspects. So if you can only travel and you don't, and taking the course doesn't make sense, you sign up for that. If you didn't go on the trip to Spain, but you're curious about these philosophical connections, consider signing up for the course at the top. So we hope that you'll do that. I also want to highlight our next Grow session, which is scheduled for October 9th at noon on the East Coast. This is we are very, very grateful that Rabbi Dan Judson is going to be talking on the past and future of liberal Judaism 2 days after the anniversary of October 7th. We hope that you'll join us for that talk. He describes as one of the casualties of the ongoing crisis in Israel has been for some, a loss of faith in the possibility of Zionism rooted in a liberal worldview. And he's going to help us explore the history to define what we mean by liberal Zionism, and then try to discern the pathway forward for those committed to a Jewish state and humanistic values. So there's a place to sign up for that, and we hope that you'll join us. This has been a wonderful session, and we hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day. And we won't see you before Rosh Hashanah, so we wish you a happy, healthy, peaceful new year, and may we all be inscribed in the book of life.
Kim, thank you so much. Shana Tova to everyone. Chris, I just want to do a quick shout out to you, to Dr. Chris, who was an amazing medical presence on our trip to Spain when some of us started falling victim to some food issues. But Chris, great to see you. And again, I just wanted you to see me recovered. So
you look great.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day, everybody. Take care.
Bye now.